Okay, so I'm in this weird position where I just woke up, so I have this voice that's like 10 times deeper than it usually is. I imagine that as we progress through part 4, and this is the finale of Video Cone, my voice is gonna go back to its normal thing, but for now, just enjoy. So, where did we leave off? By the way, if I keep looking to the side, dual monitor setup now, we're rising up. Okay, so where did we leave off? Well, we had this node network that I cleaned up just a bit because this was looking like a war zone or something. Even, I mean, these node groups are a bit cleaner, I guess, inside. Oh, never mind. This is a disaster all the way through. But we left off with, I think we have all the geometry of the cone and all the masks that we need. Namely, we have our stripe mask. We have our, what's this? It's probably our cone mask, which you can see without a displacement. So we have our, our cone mask and that punch-in mask, which some people said you could do with the RGB curves, and you'd be right. But this gives us more control outside of that RGB curves node, so that's why I did it. And also because I just didn't think of it. Here's our rounded square and the one with the margin. Okay, we've gone over this 1,000 times. And then we just, I do like seeing it flattened. And then we just kind of colored it a bit and called it done. So you might be thinking, what is part 4 for? I mean, we have the whole shape of it. What's left to do? What's left to do is just to make this look just a bit more realistic. I'm not going to really take it all the way there, but if this is our starting point and this is a 0, I can take us up to like a 6 out of 10 on realism. So step 1 is this diffuse BSDF, more like diffuse BSD garbage. We don't want it. Instead, we're going to be using a principled BSDF node, which is kind of like diffuse BSDF on like millions of steroids, right? It's just better in every way. And so, I mean, it takes longer to calculate, I imagine. But we're just going to connect this to the base color and this to our mix shader. So effectively, we've just replaced our diffuse with a principled BSDF, which gives us a lot more control, which is a good thing, but it also means we need to do a lot more work. So first of all, you see this thing is super, super shiny, and that might be good depending on what you want your cone to look like, but that is determined by the roughness. How rough is your surface? So at 0, it's kind of reflective, almost like a mirror. You can see our HDRI if you look kind of closely. And then at 1, very diffuse. And that's what the diffuse BSDF generally looks like. So instead of just picking a number for this, I want to have different roughnesses for different areas. Namely, I want a roughness of, let's say, I don't know, 0.7, 0.8, wherever we have our main cone, and then a roughness that's a bit higher wherever we have our stripes, because I want those to be worn out a bit. Or maybe I want the opposite, I don't know. So to control this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a color ramp. No, dude, my voice is booming today. It's booming. And this is going to let us control both the black areas and the white areas. So with the black areas of the cone, we just select a color, and you see we'll only affect that area. I'm going to go with something like, we could just put it in here. Let's do 0.75. And then for the white areas, I think I want the worn out look, meaning a very large roughness closer to 1. So I think I'm just going to keep it at 1. You could also do the reverse where you want those stripes nice and reflective. So I take this, plug it into roughness, and view. Okay, so now we have this. It's still a bit shiny, but we can't like really see reflections or anything. And notice that the stripes aren't like shiny at all. Okay, so that is a good start. I'm thinking also the color is a bit off, but it really depends on the kind of cone you're going for. Like in one of my animations, I did go from like a reddish cone to an orange cone. It's hard to tell what's right. Maybe it's a bit too punchy with the saturation. So like something like 0.9 would be good. But now it's looking a bit too, it's really personal preference. Okay, we can always change that later. So now we have our base color determined, we have our roughness determined, and there's a bunch of more, parameters that we can mess with. Most of them aren't actually relevant, like subsurface. Light's not really leaking through our cone. I guess it does have a bit of a subsurface property. In fact, but we're not going to mess with it. It's not metallic. It's specular you could mess with to get interesting results. And then most of these are just not relevant in any capacity, unless you want your cone to have a clear coat, like it's freshly shined, which will give it that super shiny effect. So since there's not much we can mess with here, what I do want to add is maybe some dirt, wear and tear, and we can do that for the color. So some of it's going to be brown and gross and grungy. And we can do a bit of that on the normal map, so it actually has some changes in like lighting interaction. So I'm thinking, let's do the dirt. So I'm going to mix this again. So it's going through 3 mix nodes. The first one's to determine, you know, the color of the cone and the stripes. This one's going to be our dirt, and this one was just for the transition slider we made before. That again flattens everything, shows us where it actually came from, which is cool. So we're not going to mess with that one, but we are going to mess with this one, and we want there to be some like dark brown or something like this. And we'll take that factor all the way up. So right now it's not really mixing in a nice way because it's averaging them everywhere, right? We're not saying put dirt here and not here. It's just everywhere. And that's what it would look like. So let's view the entire thing. So that actually looks pretty cool. Kind of like a metal, I don't know, hard surface cone. Either way, yeah, that looks super cool. Either way, what we're going to do is we're going to add a noise texture to define where we want dirt and not dirt, so we can plug that into the factor. And already you see that it doesn't look as bad, but the dirt is super, super subtle. And one thing to kind of wrap your head around is in this mix node, the dirt, being this like brownish black stuff, is in the second socket, meaning it's in the foreground, meaning it's going to show up wherever the factor is closer to 1, wherever it's closer to white. Okay? So keep that in mind. What we're going to do is we're going to add in a color ramp node. We're just going to add a bit of contrast here. A bit of contrast. And maybe I'm going to bring this up, bring this down, just so there isn't such a large gradient from one to the other. By the way, this isn't even connected. There we go. Now you can see. Now we can actually see splotches of dirt. And if you wanted it to be more, bit more of a fall off, you could just bring these handles further apart. But now we can actually see our dirt, and our dirt looks like trash, so let's make it look better. First of all, I like dirt with a good amount of detail. You might want a mud look, in which case you keep something like this, but if you want dirt that has you can see the individual grains, detail, maximum value, which is 16, and roughness will also change the way it looks, so this will be very muddy, and this will be very fine and detailed when you bring it close to 1. So you just want to decide what the quality of your dirt is going to look like. For me, that's this. And then finally, you can decide on the scale of your dirt. So make sure if your scale is too small, you're not going to see any features. But in some sense, it does look a bit more realistic, because as you go upwards, you're going to see like too many splotches going on. Like here, there's quite a bit going on. So maybe like 6. I don't know. We can always play with this later. Completely procedural. And we can make a nice parameter for this. Okay. So now we have our dirt, and it's showing up in some areas and not in others, and it already looks a bit better, but you know what, I was going to say let's make a better mask for this, and we will, but first, I guess, let's play a bit more with the lighting interactions with this dirt. So one thing I'm thinking is wherever there's dirt, this should have a roughness of very close to 1, right? Wherever there's dirt, it should not be shiny, because, you put this layer of dirt over it, you understand. So remember, we made this whole setup that goes into our roughness, where something closer to 1 is more rough, less shiny. So what we can do is remember, our dirt is wherever it's closer to 1, if we set this up correctly, which means what we can do, roughly, get it, is we can add this color ramp, which will add nothing wherever there isn't dirt, meaning it won't change the roughness, and wherever there is dirt, it will add some, making it a bit rougher. At least that's what it should look like. Yes. And already you can see that some of this reflection is broken up by the dirt, giving it some surface imperfections, giving it some nice detail. And all of this works whenever we change our noise. It all just works together. Okay. So I'm thinking, how do we improve this mask? Well, where does dirt accumulate naturally? Well, think about it. Where do you need to, when you're showering, where do you need to clean? Your armpits? Also in between your fingers, all this. I don't know if you're in the shower going like this, but basically what I'm saying is dirt accumulates in creases, which makes sense. I guess in some sense, if you have a big flat table, it accumulates on the surface because, that's where it would fall. But generally it accumulates in creases because otherwise it'd fall off your body. So we can do the same thing with the cone. We want a lot of dirt along this crease, definitely a lot here. Imagine how much dirt would be captured, maybe some near the floor. And there's a way to do this. You could either go with the naive approach, which actually is, it's not that naive. You use the geometry node, look for pointiness, which will, and it's hard to tell because pointiness, it doesn't give you a nice black and white 0 or 1. mask it. You have to use a color ramp to actually see the variation here, but pointiness shows where our model is pointy, which is kind of like a crease, but it also includes like corners and stuff like this that are pointing outwards. So this is one approach. What I like, and since we're using cycles, what we're going to be using is ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion, what does that mean? Well, remember, ambient occlusion is basically where an object is like self-shadowing. Where does an object cast shadows on itself? Well, definitely wherever there's creases. Like my fingers are making so many shadows here, you wouldn't believe. My armpit would have a shadow because, my shoulder's obstructing light and all this. Ambient occlusion, it looks like this, and you can kind of tell it's generally white, but a bit darker along the creases. And again, notice that it looks super broken on our base. And again, this kind of thing is solved with more subdivisions. Or you could do a nice fall off for the base. Somebody sent me a blend file where they did this. I might share. But it was a good tip. We're not doing that for this one. But it's accumulating wherever we have these creases, and as we make our subdivisions, more dense, it will be less of an issue. It's good, but we could use a bit more oomph. It's not dark enough where it should be. So I'm going to add in a math node. And you might think, oh, he's going to set it to multiply, pick a big number. It kind of works, but really this is kind of like upping the contrast. It's not what we want. So instead, I can't remember if I showed you this trick, but using power is a much, much better kind of way to go, because ambient occlusion will output a black and white mask 0 to 1, 1 where there isn't ambient occlusion, 0 where there is. Power, what it does is if you go to small numbers, like 0.5 for square root and all this, will give us a certain kind of distribution, which isn't what we want, but the other kind, x squared, x cubed, x to the power 4, will give us a nice sharpness. So let me show you what I mean. So this is 1, nothing has changed. X squared, power of 2, you can see it's starting to work. Cubed, quartic, quintic, now you're really seeing what it's doing. It's really like preserving, the differences, but it's giving us a nice, I don't want to say contrast, because that's what we said before. It's kind of more like gamma in some sense, but you can see it's really darkening those areas with a nice fall off. So this area which we said would have a ton of dirt does, and same with the base over here has a ton, while the main part of the cone not so much. So this is what we want, and we can always change this value later. So again, remember, we want dirt wherever it's white, and if we were to multiply this, these two together, so include our ambient occlusion, it's almost what we want, but not really, because we're saying keep our mask, keep our dirt wherever there's a crease, but right now it's black, so we want to invert this. So it's white, meaning preserve this dirt at the creases. So you could either try, and I've had issues with this in the past, an invert node, which will invert, right? But I'm going to go with the mathematically stable version, and let me show you how to do that. So let's clamp that. Here's what I'm going to do. So right now we have an interval of 0 to 1, and we want to reverse it 1 to 0. This will flip it. The way you do this is if you have 0 to 1, what you can do is multiply by -1. So 0 to 1 becomes -1 to 0. So think about it. Largest value is 1. That gets sent to -1. Smallest value is 0. That stays the same. So the interval flips -1 to 0. And now we just need to shift that up to 0 to 1, which you can do by adding 1. Now, ideally, this does the same thing as the invert node, but let me tell you, I've had issues with it. So here's what we're going to, keep. And now that we can actually see what's going on, so white is where we want, our dirt, we can change this exponent to really, pick what we want to happen here. And you can still do the multiply approach. But, okay. So we have this. White is where we want dirt. White is where we want dirt. And then we just multiply these together. So it needs to intersect. And at the same time. Boom. So now we have our dirt, but only in, those areas. So what do? We plug this in to our factor for where we want the dirt color, and we also need to do the same thing for the roughness, because it's not truly this where we have dirt, but where we have our final multiplication. So like this. What does that look like? Okay. It's a bit subtle, but you can see that now there's no dirt on this surface, and it's still behaving the same. It's still working correctly. Okay. Now, you might be thinking, okay, we've done it, but the dirt's not very visible, and you'd be right, and this is an easy fix. So what are we going to do? Well, before we send our dirt mask out to, work on our color, work on our roughness and all this, what we can do is multiply. And I only want to multiply on the color because I'm happy with, how it's interacting with roughness. So I'm just going to multiply on this chain and use something like 5. That's a bit much. 3. And you know what? You know what I'm thinking? Let the user decide. Make that another parameter. Let's call this dirt. Even though we have many more ways to control the dirt, like the power from before, for now we'll call this one dirt. And we'll put that there. So 0 means no dirt. 4 means a lot of dirt. 40 means mucho dirt. Okay. I'm thinking something like 4, I don't know. And then another thing we can do is if you're thinking, oh, yeah, I like the ambient occlusion, I like the idea, but it's kind of exposing, or this area is kind of exposed to no dirt. You want there to be at least a bit of dirt in that area, but still maintain most of it at the base and at the tip. What you can do is right now this ambient occlusion setup is really just saying keep it here but not here. So what you can do is do another addition, and this will add everywhere. You could add some value. So 0.5 will make it, have a bit of dirt everywhere. 0.1, just a tiny bit of dirt. I'm thinking this should also be an exposed parameter. And we'll call this is the type of thing people usually call mid-level for a, complicated, not that complicated reason. Just think about it as this isn't really giving us that much info about the dirt, but it's saying what should be the base level. So maybe dirt base would be a better name for this, but that's fine. Okay, so let's view. So when our dirt base is a large value, you can see kind of goes a bit too hard. 0, same thing as before. Let's try like a 0.2. Yeah, so now we have this subtle dirt creeping up. It's not too much, and we can make our dirt less intense with color. I'm thinking that right now we have too much oomph going on. Let's bring down our exponent, because again, this is what controls that quality. And you're going to notice that there's some weird stretching going on at the base. This is unavoidable unless, again, you make some fall off with the rounded square. But for now, we will live with it. You can always play with this later and also change the color of the dirt. But we can now have dirt and be happy about it. Okay, so now how do we take it to the next level? We have our color interaction. We have our roughness interaction. Do we have normal interaction? No. So let's add a bump node. This will convert height maps into normal maps, essentially. And we want bump wherever there's dirt, right? We want there to be a bit of elevation wherever there's dirt, fine. And maybe we also want a bit of elevation on the stripes. So they're not really like part of the cone, but they're painted on, and there's this thin layer of paint that's a bit higher than the cone. Okay, let's do that. So first of all, how do we make dirt? How do we do this with dirt? Well, first of all, let's see. I already forgot which of these we want. So this one is the one that doesn't have ambient occlusion factor. Or no, it does because of our addition. It's kind of subtle. And then this one's the one we manipulated. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in this one. Can't even see what I'm doing. We're going to plug it in here and then just convert it to height since we put it in the wrong socket. Let's see what that looks like. You're going to notice there's definitely some normals going on here. I'm just going to let it render a bit. But it's a bit too intense. It kind of looks like the cone is made out of like tree bark or something because there's a very thin layer of dirt. A very thin layer of dirt, like almost everywhere. So there's going to be that like normal stuff everywhere. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to use this for the strength, which should make it a bit better. Yes, you can already see now our reflections are popping. So before, no reflections at all because and this isn't roughness. This is literally making our surface rough or deforming it kind of in the normal sense, right? But when you include in strength, it kind of takes care of most of this. So we do still have a good amount of bump wherever there's dirt, but not so much where it's very, subtle. Okay, awesome. Now let's also include our stripe mask, which is already conveniently white where there is stripes. So that's saying there's height where there is stripes and there isn't height otherwise. So all we need to do is a bit of math. Addition I'm going to do only the height. I'm not going to have this one manipulate strength or anything. And we just plug this in here. So now it's adding these two. So now you can see this is included. So there's definitely going to be quite a bit of height there. And let's clean this up and visualize. Boom. This is a very dirty cone. Let me get me on the main screen. A very dirty cone. I love this dual monitor setup. Okay, cool. So let's do some final touches. I'm thinking color is still a bit off. I don't know why. Just feels wrong. I feel like this traditional orangey cone color maybe fits a bit better. Somewhere in between like that. Cool. And you might be thinking, okay, this is a pretty realistic cone. Could be better. Well, let me remind you, in case you have forgotten, that this is a plane. So we're doing pretty well considering that this isn't an actual cone. I'm thinking these stripes are a bit off. We could change the stripe color. Again, we determined our stripe versus cone color in this node. So we can make those darker, brighter, maybe even make them a tiny bit yellow. Tiny bit yellow. I like the look of that. And now something I want to do, this is just because I like doing it. This isn't actually necessary for the cone. So remember, our transition slider controlled this node right here. This is the final color change. That will make everything white if our transition is set to 0, 1, something like that. And it's also affecting our displacement. As you can see, it's feeding into the strength. I wanted to be able to do that thing where, you know, we're transitioning between a plane and a cone, but you can see it's not really doing it very well because it doesn't really handle this transparency, and you can see all this dirt and stuff we've just added is still incorporated on this plane, and I think this is because of roughness, right? It worked with the diffuse, but because we're using a principled BSDF, it doesn't do it anymore. So let's actually take care of that. So we don't need this. We'll just have this feed directly in. So this is what it looks like. Let's make our value 1 again. So it should look the same, our cone right now. Should look the same. But we wanted to have a final choice of flattening it. So what we're going to do is at the very end, we've done all of this. We've done our parameters, feed into masks, feed into, you know, color-related stuff, feed into BSDFs. After all this, we're going to add in a mix shader. We're going to mix this with a diffuse BSDF. So notice now, once we do this, no transparency or anything. Once we set factor to 1, because that's after the fact. So our transparency is like back here in this mix shader. After that, mix, right? So before, after, gets rid of the transparency. So we want this, and we'll plug this in as the factor. We might need to invert it. Need to think about that. And it's already connected to displacement, so we're there. And instead of inverting, I believe if we just flip these, that should do it. So let's see what we get. Let's see what we get. I'm doing a save. Here we go, boys. So when transition is 1, meaning 100%, have the cone. When it's 0, have the plane. Why is this working? Well, because it's controlling both displacement and the final BSDF result. So here's what it looks like. So now you can see this. I'm sorry that it's super laggy. It's because I'm recording and have cycles at the same time. So we'll do it in steps. So 0.2, you can see the cone starting to rise. There's a bit of roughness interaction. 0.4, the plane's becoming a bit transparent. 0.6, now we're really starting to get a bit of color. 0.8, and I guess the color does show up pretty late into the process. And I guess that's just how stuff is mixed together. So if you want more control over this, you could, I've lost my nodes. If you want more control over this, you can do it back in the color level before the BSDF level. But I do like the way this looks. I love adding a transition slider, just being like, oh, you thought it was like an average looking cone? You know, it's all right. No, it's a plane. So there you go. I think we've taken care of everything we would want. So again, we replaced our diffuse for a principled. We're controlling the color, the roughness, the normal. I feel like that's it, really. Well, what you could do is you could, I mean, actually you can't. What I was going to say is you could use this dirt to add a bit of displacement, right? Displacement instead of bump. But what you have to realize is our displacement is calculated first to deform the geometry. And then we did the dirt stuff, right? Because this noise would not wrap around this mesh like this until displacement was enabled. So there's kind of like an order of operations. My voice, I feel like, maintained its boominess throughout the whole thing. So there you go. I've now showed you how to make a cone, a cone out of a plane. I don't know why it's useful, but you did learn quite a bit. Remember, we have these parameters for pretty much everything. A bit of a highlight reel. We have our general dirt, basically saying, you know, what about the general area that isn't super high on ambient occlusion? We have our dirt, which is kind of just controlling the color. We have our stripe, which is the distortion, I believe, unless it's something else. Oh no, this is the stripe offset. So where do you want it on the cone? We have our stripe distortion, which is distortion. We have our cone height, which again plays nicely with everything. This is the awesome thing about it. We can now make any kind of cone that can be made out of these parameters. We have our roundness, which will break the cone if you set it to values that don't work. So you can make it a sharp cone, round cone, side length, thick cone, base height, tall cone. Now you can really see stuff starting to break. Punch in is the whole depth, and margin is just for like rendering stuff. So we have all these parameters, and the nice thing about this is since it's all working with these texture coordinates, I believe, unless I've forgotten something, I believe what we should be able to do is literally just move our cone along the plane. So you can see what's happening here. We're just shifting our cone along the plane. We could also rotate the cone. So this is kind of like, whoops, I wanted a vector rotate node. This is kind of just like moving your object once you've modeled it. Yeah, so we're rotating our cone. You could really use it like a three-dimensional object. And in fact, since we made this, you can make a ton of cones on a single plane, all this. But there you go. I think this is pretty good. I'm going to make this project file available to all the patrons above. I think it's $5 gives you the project files. And I'll also probably give the cone I made originally because there might be some variations. This one might even be better than the one I made originally because I could talk it out and everything. But yeah, let me put me on the main screen. There you go. PRO-CEDURAL, what a wave. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, Part 4, you learned how to make everything. And I might do more advanced shader node tutorials if people are into it. And I like the idea, so we'll do ideas more interesting than cones. Maybe we'll look into vector displacement. I don't know. But yeah.